The year was 1945. Across the green shoulders of southern Bavaria, spring sunlight crept cautiously over a land that no longer knew its name. The war was over, or at least that's what the newspapers claimed. But for those still trudging through the mud of surrender, the war had not ended. It had only changed its shape. It no longer thundered through the skies or echoed from the mountains. It lived now in silence, in the hollow eyes of women who once believed their country could not fall. Trucks bearing white stars rolled through narrow roads that smelled of wet hay and smoke. Behind them, farmers leaned on fence posts, watching as convoys of weary faces passed. Women in gray coats, nurses, telephone clerks, widows, and daughters, now labeled as prisoners. They clutched blankets and canvas satchels that carried all that was left of their lives. Some were young enough to have known only Hitler's Germany. Others remembered a gentler one, when the word Strudel meant Sunday, not survival. The American internment camp near Garmisch was not the kind of prison they had imagined. It was organized, strangely polite, almost too clean. The fences gleamed silver in the new light, and the guards, boys really, in pressed uniforms and rolled sleeves, spoke with a casual friendliness that unsettled them. One German nurse, no more than 23, whispered that the Americans smiled too easily, as if they didn't understand the gravity of victory. She would later admit, "It was their calm that frightened us most." They acted as though the world had already moved on. Inside the camp, life unfolded according to a rhythm both foreign and familiar. Morning inspections, ration distributions, occasional medical exams, and the same English phrases repeated through tinny loudspeakers. "Please remain in line. Breakfast at 0700. The women pretended not to listen, though many secretly practiced the words when no one was watching. Beneath the humiliation, curiosity stirred. Who were these victors who offered blankets, cigarettes, even smiles, instead of vengeance? For the Americans, the camp was a duty, not a punishment. Many of the soldiers and cooks had been civilians just months earlier. Farmers, mechanics, bakers, and waiters pulled into a war they scarcely understood. One of them, Corporal James Hanley of Chicago, had once worked in his father's bakery on Halsted Street. His specialty was apple pie, but he had learned strudel from a German immigrant who baked next door. When Hanley was drafted, he took the recipe with him, scribbled on a grease-stained index card folded into his Bible. Now, in this camp surrounded by the ghosts of a fallen Reich, he found himself making dough again, this time under a different flag. To the German women, the idea of an American baking strudel bordered on blasphemy. They spoke of it in whispers behind the barracks, their tone half pride, half disbelief. "Strudel is ours," one woman said, folding her arms tightly. "They can make meatloaf and hamburgers, but Apfelstrudel, that is German soul." Another scoffed that the Americans probably filled it with canned fruit and sugar water, the same way they fill their coffee with cream. Even laughter, brittle as frost, returned for a moment. In defeat, pride became their last defense. Outside, the air smelled faintly of spring and coal smoke. The snowmelt carried debris from the villages, bits of uniforms, shattered glass, a child's doll missing its eyes. The women had learned to stop looking too closely at what floated past. Their world had been dismantled piece by piece, first by bombs, then by surrender, and now by the strange mercy of their captors. Mercy, they discovered, could wound in its own way. It forced them to see that the enemy was human, and that was harder to bear than hate. One afternoon, as the sun slipped low and gold over the barbed wire, an aroma drifted across the camp. It was sweet, buttery, alive with cinnamon. Heads turned instinctively toward the kitchen block. For a few seconds, even the guards paused their patrols, sniffing the air with faint smiles. A German woman murmured, "That smell, it cannot be." Another whispered, "It is strudel." The word rolled through the line of women like a tremor. They craned their necks, searching for confirmation. Through the open doorway, they could see Americans in white aprons, laughing, rolling dough, brushing it with melted butter. The sight stung. How dare they? How could the same hands that held rifles also fold pastry with such tenderness? A few women turned away in disgust. Others felt something more dangerous, hunger. Inside the kitchen, Corporal Hanley worked quietly. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, his hands dusted white with flour. He wasn't thinking about symbolism or politics. He was thinking about getting the dough thin enough to read a letter through. The sergeant beside him joked, "Guess we're teaching them democracy through dessert." Hanley only smiled. Maybe. Or maybe we're just feeding people who forgot what warm food tastes like. That night, the rumor became camp legend. The Americans were preparing apple strudel for the prisoners. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others prayed it was true. The following morning, as the women lined up for their rations, boiled potatoes, bread, and a ladle of soup, they caught sight of something new on the tray line. Steam rose from rows of golden pastries, their edges crisp and glistening, the scent so rich it almost hurt to breathe. For a long moment no one moved. Even the guards seemed to hesitate, aware that something delicate was unfolding. A sergeant called out the ration count. The first woman stepped forward, trembling slightly. She looked down at the strudel on her tin plate, then up at the soldier who handed it to her. He smiled, not mockingly but gently, as if offering peace. She didn't smile back. She only nodded and carried it to the bench. When she cut into it, the pastry flaked cleanly. The apples were soft but not soggy, touched with lemon, spiced just enough to make memory stir. She tasted, and the world tilted just a little. It was impossibly perfect. Around her, others followed. The first sound was not approval but silence, the kind that comes when pride meets truth. Then someone laughed, quietly, as if embarrassed. Someone else muttered, "Impossible." But soon, even the most stubborn found themselves eating every crumb. Later that night, a nurse wrote in her confiscated diary, "They make it better than we do. And I hate them for it, but also, I don't." The next day, whispers spread again, not of politics or surrender, but of recipes. The war had burned entire cities, yet somehow, in this fenced corner of Bavaria, it had also baked an unexpected kind of peace. And still, behind the gentle sweetness of that discovery, a question lingered. If the Americans could master the very soul of German comfort, what else might they remake in their image? The answer, as the women would soon learn, would come not from the guns of victory, but from the kitchens of mercy. The mornings in the camp began with the clang of tin cups and the rasp of boots on gravel. Mist hung low over the barracks, softening the edges of the wire fences, turning them ghostly. The women woke to the same dull hunger, the same metallic taste of fear that refused to fade, and lined up for breakfast under the watchful eyes of the guards. The air smelled faintly of smoke, soap, and something they could not yet name, something warm, rich, and foreign drifting from the kitchen block. For a moment, the women forgot their shame long enough to wonder, what could possibly smell so good in a place built for punishment? Inside the kitchen, life beat to a different rhythm. The clang of ladles, the hiss of steam, the hissed jokes between soldiers, these replaced the barking of orders and the crack of gunfire that had ruled the months before. It was a strange irony of war. Some men who once carried rifles now carried rolling pins. Corporal James Hanley had found his post-war identity at a flour-dusted counter, sleeves rolled, apron tied crookedly, his once battle-hardened hands steadying a wooden spoon instead of a weapon. He wasn't sure whether to feel shame or relief. The army had taught him to destroy, now it demanded he feed those it had conquered. Behind him, Sergeant Peters called out from the pantry, "Hanley, you sure about this? These women probably think cinnamon's a war crime." Hanley laughed under his breath. "Maybe. But it's all we've got left to fight with." The humor masked something else, an unspoken discomfort with the idea that kindness might now be their weapon. He measured sugar into a large pot, added water, and watched it dissolve, the scent of caramel and apples beginning to thicken the air. Every swirl of the spoon felt like an act of rebellion against what the world had just endured. Outside, the women noticed the change first by scent, then by rumor. "They're baking again," whispered a tall brunette who had once worked in a pastry shop in Augsburg. "Not bread this time. Something sweet." A nurse, her sleeves rolled high from scrubbing latrines, scoffed. "Americans can't even make proper coffee. What do they know about pastry?" The others murmured agreement, but their tone carried more yearning than ridicule. Hunger was no longer just for food. It was for proof that life could still taste good. By noon, the camp had transformed into a strange blend of suspicion and anticipation. Smoke rose from the chimneys, thick with the scent of butter and baked fruit, wrapping around the fences like a temptation. The guards joked with one another, pretending not to notice the way every prisoner's eyes followed the drifting clouds. Hanley and his small team worked relentlessly inside, improvising with the ingredients at hand: army flour, canned apples from surplus rations, a pinch of nutmeg scrounged from a Red Cross crate. They had no delicate puff pastry or fine German butter, yet somehow, as the dough thinned beneath their rolling pins, the kitchen filled with a sense of something sacred. Private Reynolds leaned against the counter, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You ever think it's strange, Sarge? Feeding the same folks who shot at us last year." Hanley paused, the whisk stilled in his hand. "Yeah," he said quietly. "But maybe that's how we win for real." He didn't mean victory in the military sense. He meant something gentler, something harder. The kind of victory that didn't fit on a medal. Through the kitchen window, Hanley could see the German women gathered in small knots near the fence, their faces pale and watchful. They weren't shouting insults anymore. They were waiting. Some folded their arms, pretending indifference, while others sniffed the air like it might betray a secret. The sight of them stirred something uneasy in him, a realization that feeding the defeated demanded more courage than fighting them ever had. Mercy, he thought, was heavier than any rifle. In the afternoon, a group of women was ordered to help scrub the mess hall floors. Among them was the pastry worker from Augsburg. Her name, as Hanley would later learn, was Marta. She moved with quiet precision, eyes down, her hands red from soap and cold water. When she heard the ovens clatter open behind her, instinct made her glance back. For a heartbeat, her old life returned. The smell of browned pastry, the soft crackle of buttered crust. She froze, then looked away quickly, ashamed of her own nostalgia. The war had turned memory into betrayal. Hanley noticed her hesitation. "Without thinking," he said gently, "you've baked before, haven't you?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marta straightened, not daring to look at him. "Everyone in Germany has baked," she said flatly, her accent clipped, proud. He nodded, almost smiling. "Then you'll know if we're doing it right." She shot him a glare, half insulted, half intrigued. It was the first honest look between them. That evening, as the sun bled orange behind the Alps, the kitchen became a small theater of tension and creation. Dough stretched thin enough to let light through. Apples tossed in syrup gleamed like amber. Hanley worked quietly, occasionally glancing toward the window, aware that the eyes outside were not just watching food, they were watching dignity being rewritten. The American camp had taken everything from those women except one thing: their belief that no one could bake like a German. Now, even that certainty trembled. When the strudels were finally pulled from the ovens, the soldiers stood back in silence. Steam rose from the trays like incense, carrying with it an aroma that didn't belong to any flag. It was universal: warmth, sugar, memory. Peters crossed his arms and whistled softly. "Well, damn, Hanley. Smells like peace." Hanley chuckled, though there was a flicker of sadness in his smile. "Peace," he murmured. "Or surrender." Outside, the guards carried the trays toward the mess hall, the aroma preceding them like a herald. The German women stood still, their faces a mix of disbelief and pride disguised as disdain. One muttered, "We'll see if they can even roll it right." Another whispered, "They'll drown it in sugar like everything else." But as the trays passed, even mockery faltered. The strudels looked perfect. Thin, flaky layers folded with care, edges golden, the filling bubbling gently beneath the crust. Marta stared longest. She could tell, even from a distance, that whoever made them understood the craft. The fold lines, the butter marks, the way the pastry had breathed in the oven, it was no accident. She felt a sting she couldn't explain, as if her own pride had been quietly matched. When the first tray reached the serving table, silence spread across the camp. Even the guards stopped talking. For the prisoners, it wasn't about dessert, it was about something deeper, who they were now and what they had lost. Food, they realized, could wound as much as bullets when it came from the hands of an enemy who did it better. Hanley watched from the kitchen doorway, flour still on his hands, as the first women hesitated before their plates. He could not hear their words, but he recognized the look, resistance giving way to hunger, pride bending under the weight of simple human need. He turned back toward the ovens, uncertain whether he'd done something merciful or cruel. That night, as the camp lights dimmed and the scent of apples lingered like a ghost, Marta lay awake replaying the sight of those American bakers, their laughter, their precision, their calm. For the first time since her capture, she felt something unexpected: curiosity. How could they, the victors, care so much about getting something so small, so right? She didn't yet know that soon she would find herself standing beside them, flour on her own hands, learning the recipe she once vowed no foreigner could master. The morning after the strudels were baked, the camp awoke to a silence that felt heavier than frost. Even the usual coughs, shouts, and clatter of boots seemed dulled. Steam rose from the field kitchens, drifting lazily into the pale Bavarian sky, carrying with it that same maddening scent: apple, butter, and something almost holy. For the German women, it was both a torment and a temptation. They had spent years living on bitterness. Now, sweetness threatened to undo them. Marta stood in line, her hands folded tightly beneath her shawl. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that American baker, Hanley, bent over the dough with the focus of a craftsman. She hated that image for its grace. She hated that she wanted to see it again. Around her, the women whispered, voices clipped and tense. "They'll feed it to the officers first. It's probably fake. Propaganda." But underneath the scorn, hunger crackled like static. When the mess hall doors opened, the smell hit them full force. The women hesitated, then filed in with slow, deliberate steps. The light inside was dim, filtered through windows smeared with grease and frost. The long tables gleamed with tin trays, and at their center waited the strudel, rows of it, still warm, still steaming. Even in defeat, beauty had a way of commanding silence. A corporal handed out portions with mechanical precision. One woman muttered, "They think we'll forget everything for a piece of pastry." The soldier didn't respond. He just placed a slice on her plate and moved on. When Marta's turn came, she looked at her portion with suspicion. The crust was golden, the filling amber and glistening. She wanted to reject it, to prove that pride could fill the stomach. But her hands betrayed her. The first bite was cautious, almost defiant. The pastry gave way with a soft crackle, the apples still tender beneath their sugared glaze. The taste was balanced, neither too sweet nor too heavy, touched with lemon, finished with the warmth of cinnamon. It was perfect, too perfect. Marta froze mid-bite. Around her, others were tasting, faces shifting through disbelief, resentment, and, finally, quiet surrender. No one spoke, but something inside the room changed. For months, their mouths had known only the taste of fear. Now it was butter and fruit. It was memory. It was humiliation wrapped in mercy. Hanley stood by the doorway, watching. He didn't look triumphant. He looked thoughtful, even troubled. When Sergeant Peters elbowed him and said, "Guess we converted him," Hanley only shook his head. "No," he murmured, "just reminded them they're human." At another table, one woman began to cry, softly, almost soundlessly. She had once owned a cafe in Munich, now reduced to ash. The strudel tasted like what her husband used to bring home on Sundays, before the sirens. "It's the same," she whispered to herself, though she knew it wasn't. It was better. That realization burned worse than hunger. Across from her, a Red Cross volunteer slipped her an extra napkin and said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only form of grace left. By afternoon, the story had spread through every barrack. The American strudel had outdone the German one. It became a phrase uttered half jokingly, half in shame. They even bake better than us now. The women argued over how it was possible. Some claimed the flour was American, lighter and richer. Others said the ovens burned hotter. Marta alone suspected the truth, that it wasn't about ingredients at all. It was about care. The Americans, infuriatingly, had baked as if they believed the women deserved something good. That night, Marta was assigned to help scrub the kitchen floor. She tried not to look at the counter where the pastries had cooled. But Hanley was there again, sleeves rolled, wiping down trays. He noticed her glance and smiled faintly. "Did you try it?" he asked. She stiffened. "It was edible." He grinned. "Edible's a start." She turned away, embarrassed by the warmth creeping into her cheeks. "You use too much sugar," she said sharply. "Ah," he replied, pretending to take notes on an invisible pad. Expert feedback from the competition. Something in his easy tone disarmed her. No arrogance, no mockery, just a kind of quiet respect that confused her more than cruelty ever could. For months they had been trained to think of Americans as barbarians. Loud, uncultured, crude. Yet this one handled pastry like a poet. She wondered if he had family, if he'd left someone waiting. She hated herself for wondering. Over the next days, more batches were baked, some for the guards, some for the prisoners. Eventually, a few of the German women were allowed to help in the kitchen under supervision. Marta volunteered without knowing why. The first time she stepped inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. Hanley handed her a rolling pin. "Think you can handle this?" She met his eyes. "I was baking before you were born." Working beside him, she found herself falling into old rhythms. The dough under her palms, the faint creak of the wooden table, the soft hum of conversation, it all felt impossibly normal. Hanley whistled as he worked, some American tune she didn't recognize. When he caught her listening, he stopped. "Sorry." "Habit." She shrugged. "It's better than the shouting." That made him smile again, the kind of smile that didn't feel like victory, just acknowledgement. One afternoon, she showed him how to stretch the dough thinner, lifting it gently until the light shone through like parchment. "It must breathe," she explained. "Otherwise it dies in the oven." Hanley nodded, repeating the motion carefully. "Let it breathe," he said under his breath, as if committing it to memory. The moment felt strangely intimate. Two enemies united by pastry, bound not by politics but by the language of craft. Outside, the war's ruins still smoked. Train tracks twisted through fields, children scavenged for coal, and the churches stood roofless against gray skies. Yet inside that kitchen, something fragile and forbidden grew, the awareness that humanity had survived the wreckage. For Marta, it was unbearable and beautiful all at once. A week later, as rations improved and tension eased, Hanley surprised the women with another dessert, small pies shaped like hearts. "American tradition," he said, smiling sheepishly. "Valentine's Day." The women exchanged confused looks. They didn't know what Valentine's Day was. But when they bit into the pies, simple crust, soft fruit filling, they laughed. Real laughter, unguarded, echoing across the mess hall like the return of spring. For the first time, the guards didn't hush them. That evening, Marta found herself writing again in her confiscated diary, the same one she'd hidden in her shoe. Her words came slowly, uncertainly. "I thought mercy was weakness. I thought sweetness was for the naive. But today I saw men make art from flour and fire, and I felt something break inside me, not in pain, but in recognition." She paused, then added one final line. "Perhaps defeat is just the beginning of honesty." When Hanley saw her leaving later, he called out softly, "Tomorrow we try it your way." She turned, puzzled. My way. The real German recipe, he said. No shortcuts. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, she said quietly. But you'll need patience. Hanley smiled. After this war, patience is all I've got left. The ovens behind them glowed like small suns, and for the first time in months, neither victory nor defeat seemed to matter, only what could be made with steady hands and forgiveness. By late spring of 1946, the fences around the camp no longer looked like cages, just boundaries waiting to be forgotten. The war's thunder had long gone quiet, leaving behind only the hum of rebuilding. Villages were sprouting new roofs, trains were running again, and even the ruins had begun to bloom with weeds and wildflowers. But inside that American camp, the strangest reconstruction of all was happening, not of buildings or politics, but of people. Every morning, the ovens lit up before the sun did, and the scent of pastry drifted out like a flag no nation owned. Marta worked beside Hanley now, her hair tied back with a faded ribbon, the rhythm of her hands as certain as breath. She no longer scrubbed floors, she baked. The soldiers still called her Fräulein Strudel, a nickname that had started as a joke and ended as a title. She didn't correct them. Each fold of dough felt like stitching two worlds together, one that had burned and one that was learning to forgive. Hanley, for his part, had changed too. The sharp edges of his soldier's posture had softened. His laughter came easier, though sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his eyes carried that haunted faraway look, the kind men wore when they'd seen too much. He often said baking helped quiet the noise left in his head. I figure, he told Marta once, if you can make something sweet after everything turns bitter, maybe that's what winning really means. She didn't answer, but her silence agreed. The camp commander, Colonel Whitman, visited one afternoon, inspecting the kitchen like a general surveying a battlefield. Smells like victory, he said dryly, watching Hanley pull a tray from the oven. Marta straightened at his voice, uneasy under authority again. But Whitman surprised her. You, he said, gesturing toward her with a half-smile, they say your Strudel could start another peace conference. The room chuckled, but there was truth in his tone. Food, in that place, had become something political, an unspoken treaty between conqueror and conquered. When a Red Cross representative arrived weeks later, she proposed something unheard of, an exchange. American cooks would share their recipes with local German women, and in return, the women would teach their traditional dishes. A culinary armistice, she called it. The idea spread through the camp faster than rumor. Some soldiers joked that diplomacy by dessert might do what treaties never could. Others weren't sure if it was right to break bread with former enemies. But Hanley said quietly, "You can't stay enemies when you've shared an oven." The first joint baking day was awkward. German women arrived from nearby villages, wearing patched dresses and guarded expressions. The Americans, aprons tied and sleeves rolled, tried to look less like soldiers and more like hosts. Marta and Hanley led the session together. They stood side by side at the long wooden table, showing how to roll the dough thin, how to brush it with butter, how to fold it so the layers would puff instead of break. Marta demonstrated with her usual precision. Hanley followed, mimicking her gestures until she nodded approval. Slowly, laughter began to ripple through the room, tentative at first, then louder, warmer. Someone began humming a folk tune, and soon voices joined in from both sides. When the strudels were done, they lined them up along the counter like trophies of peace. Each one slightly different, some more golden, some more rustic, but all beautiful. The smell filled the room, mingling with the sound of laughter and clinking utensils. A soldier snapped a photograph. Flour on faces, smiles crooked, hands dusted white. Years later, historians would find that photograph and call it the Strudel Truce. For Marta, it was the first day she no longer felt like a prisoner. She realized she had stopped flinching when someone said, "American." For Hanley, it was the day he understood that the war had not really ended with surrender papers, but with forgiveness written in crumbs and laughter. That summer, as demobilization orders came through, the camp began to empty. Soldiers packed up, fences were taken down, and the kitchen fell quiet. On Hanley's last morning, he found Marta already there, kneading dough. She didn't look up when she said, "You're leaving." He nodded, resting his hands on the table. "They're sending me home," he said softly. "Back to Chicago. My father's bakery's still standing. Needs help." She pressed her palms into the dough harder than necessary. "Then you'll make strudel there," she said. He smiled faintly. "Only if you send me the recipe." For a moment neither spoke. The ovens clicked softly as they cooled. Then Marta reached for a small scrap of paper from her apron pocket, a handwritten recipe, the ink smudged and flour-stained. She placed it on the table. "It's not just the ingredients," she said quietly. "It's how you feel when you make it. If you rush, it dies." He folded the note carefully, tucking it into his breast pocket like something sacred. "I won't rush," he said. When the trucks came that afternoon, the prisoners gathered to watch the soldiers depart. Some waved shyly. Others stood still, uncertain whether gratitude was allowed. Hanley climbed aboard, turning once to find Marta in the crowd. She was standing near the gate, flour still streaked on her cheek. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment it felt like an ending too simple for what it meant. He raised a hand. She lifted hers in return. Then the truck rolled away, leaving behind only dust and the faint smell of apples. Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself, and so did the world. Cities rose from rubble, and peace found strange new forms. In Chicago, the Hanley Bakery became famous for something it had never sold before the war: apple strudel. Customers came from miles away for its perfect balance of sweetness and spice. When asked about the recipe, James Hanley would smile and say, "An old friend taught me. Best teacher I ever had." Meanwhile, in a quiet village near Garmisch, an older woman baked on Sundays for her grandchildren. Her hands were slower now, her hair streaked with silver, but her precision remained. She told the children stories as she worked, stories of a war, a camp, and a man who learned to bake like a German but smile like an American. The little ones laughed, certain she was making it up. "No," she would say softly, eyes glimmering. "Sometimes peace begins with dessert." One day she found an envelope in her postbox. Inside was a photograph, black and white, edges faded. It showed a bakery window in Chicago, the sign above it reading Hanley and Son. Behind the glass, trays of strudel gleamed like gold. At the bottom of the photo, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "Still not rushing." She pressed the photo to her chest, her eyes stinging with tears she hadn't expected. The war had taken everything that once defined her. Yet through a single act of creation, she had reclaimed something greater than victory: connection. That night, she lit a candle and placed the photograph beside it. The smell of warm apples filled her kitchen once more, mingling with the soft sound of rain outside. As the first strudel browned in the oven, she whispered, "You baked it better, I'll admit it." Then she smiled through the quiet ache. "But I taught you how." And across an ocean, though she would never know it, another oven flickered to life. The same recipe, the same rhythm, the same fragile miracle. Sometimes, wars end not with signatures or speeches, but with the simple mercy of two people sharing what they love.